Hi, everyone. Welcome to this conversation on continuous research. Thank you all for joining us on time. We are expecting an awesome turnout today. I think we've had something like 800 plus people register for this webinar. So clearly a hot topic. I'm going to leave just a couple of minutes for folks to join in the webinar and get settled in before officially kicking things off and introducing our speakers. My name's Zoe Nagara. I'm the head of product marketing at User Interviews. And today's webinar is a collaboration between User Interviews and our partners at Sprig. Together, we represent just two tools that teams can use to continuously learn from their users. A little bit of housekeeping before we kick off. Please note that this session is being recorded today. And we are, of course, using Zoom's webinar tool, which includes a chat box, a Q&A box, and a polling feature. And we're going to be using all three of those features today. So please use the chat for any general thoughts, reactions, chit chat. We love audience engagement throughout. But that said, if you do have a specific question for one of our speakers, please post it in the Q&A box so it doesn't get lost in the chat. You can also view and upvote other people's questions, and we will be tackling them at the end of the webinar in order of votes. We are also going to be initiating a couple of multiple choice polls throughout, so we can learn a little bit about who's in the audience and where you all are at on your own continuous research journey. But you don't need to worry too much about those for now. You'll know them when you see them. Okay, I think we're reaching a quorum. I think we're just about ready to get started. Hello and welcome to anyone who's just joined. Again, my name's Zoe. I'm here to kick us off and introduce our speakers. We have an hour together today. The rough agenda is 45 minutes of discussion, followed by around 15 minutes of audience Q&A. For the discussion piece, we've put together an interesting format. Our two speakers will essentially be interviewing each other to tease out two different perspectives on continuous research, answering along the way, what it is, why it's valuable, when you should do it, and laying out a tactical approach to actually put a continuous research program into practice at your own company. I do want to provide a little bit of background about Sprig and User Interviews for those who may not be so familiar. Sprig is a user research platform that enables teams to evaluate their product's user experience in the moment and test new product concepts. Sprig makes it easy to customize and launch in-product research studies with minimal engineering support and cuts down on hours of tedious research tasks with open text response analysis. And User Interviews is a fast and easy way to find the right participants for research. You can build and manage your own panel of real users, or you can recruit participants on demand from our audience of over 1 million. We make sourcing, screening, scheduling, incentives, messaging, all the aspects of research recruiting simpler. Okay, I think that's it for introductory notes. So let's go ahead and meet our speakers. I'm thrilled to have Allison Dickin from Sprig and Paolo Appley from User Interviews joining us today. They are representing not just two different companies, but also two distinct personas within the research community. Allison herself is a user researcher, while Paolo's embodying the voice of the product manager. So I think these dual perspectives should make for some rich conversation full of good discussion and debate. So Allison, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself first, and then Paolo, you do the same, and then over to you both to lead us through the session.
Thanks, Zoe. I'm really excited to be here today talking about continuous research. It is a topic close to my heart. So I've been a researcher. I've been doing research for many years now. I spent some time before joining Sprig at Etsy, leading the seller research team there. While I was there, I built out kind of a proto-continuous research program, you might say, and was able to build on that experience later on. I'm happy to share more about that later in the webinar. For the last 2.5 to 3 years, I've been at Sprig, starting the research team there and helping grow the platform.
Cool, and I'm Paolo Appley. I'm a PM at User Interviews. Likewise, also very excited to chat about continuous research. My background is actually, I started my career in design and was sort of introduced to the power of talking to people and how that impacts the work that I was doing during that process. And over time, I've switched into product management and product. I'm really excited to sort of share the product perspective on continuous research, and also chat with Allison about the two worlds of continuous research that we're going to describe today.
Awesome. So I think, to kick this conversation off, we first need to define what we mean by continuous research. So I will kick it over to you, Paolo, to start and to hear about how you define continuous research.
Yeah, maybe to start, I'll give a little context about how we work at user interviews. I think I'll be referring to that product perspective fairly often. So here at user interviews, we work in what we call product pods. So those are cross-functional teams focused around outcomes that tend to be quarter or multi-quarter sort of things that we're focused on. When I say cross-functional, that means product management, which is the role I play. We've got design, tech, and analyst leads that sort of forms a core of the product pod. But then we also have additional engineers as part of the team. And at user interviews, it also includes customer success and operations, sort of embedded, representatives embedded. They're such big and important teams for what we do. So that's just a little of like who the team is. For us, continuous research means like every week we're talking to at least one person in our target audience, and that's a subset of the cross-functional team. So usually 2 to 3 people having at least one conversation every week. Those interviews tend to be fairly open-ended. The goal is not to test an idea, but really to understand the perspective and the problem space of that person that we're talking to. So I'll dive into some specific examples, I think, later on, but for us, that's sort of the basics for what continuous research looks like. But maybe, Allison, we can hear what it looks like at Sprig a bit more.
Yeah, sure. I definitely am aligned with you on the aspect of kind of focusing on the customer's experience and putting that first. I think for how I think of continuous research, just at a like high level first, is just as a way of continuously collecting feedback and insights from customers, through whether it's the way that you're doing it at user interviews, through ongoing customer interviews, the way we do it at Sprig, which again I will talk about a little bit more when we get into the frameworks, is primarily the hub of it essentially is through in-context surveys that we're running within the product experience of Sprig. But really, the goal that we're trying to get at is understanding from the user's perspective, what's important to them, what their needs are, what's going on with them right now, and having that drive the insights rather than focusing just on the specific hypotheses we already have, or the initiatives that are just on the roadmap. And we do that research as well, but for the continuous research, we're really adding that customer-led perspective, I guess, to the kind of body of insights that we're collecting in our research program. And this really kind of helps focus, like, the things that we get out of it are being able to kind of catch red flags or warning signs earlier in the process before we might be thinking about something as an issue. It also helps us kind of flag and identify new opportunities that we might want to explore more. And it also helps to kind of bring, center the organization a little bit more than it might ordinarily be on the customer's point of view. So we found it to be super valuable and, definitely worth the time. I'm curious, to hear from your side, especially, from my perspective as a researcher. I just love that you're doing this as a product team, as a like product-led effort. And I'm curious to hear how you, what was the impetus for this program on your side? What led you to set it up?
Yeah, I think there are probably 2 parts of this that are worth talking about. One is the company context. Teaser will be doing a poll in a bit about sort of like what folks in the audience what they're doing today, and I know like the company context is really critical for that side. So I'll talk a little bit maybe about company context, and then I'll sort of talk about my personal experience. So user interviews, obviously, it's part of the name. It's something that's really important to us. But I think the founding story is also like an important part of the story here. So the founders for user interviews, they were actually originally pursuing a different idea that failed. And when they sort of thought back about why that idea failed, one of the main reasons was they felt like they hadn't talked to enough people in the target audience that they thought the solution would work for. And so in the next round of ideas, they sort of pivoted and were pursuing some other ideas for new startups. And they said, okay, this time we're gonna talk to more people and really vet out the problem space. Turned out that was very hard to do. They had a hard time finding and actually getting a hold of people in their target audience. And so that's where user interviews was born. So talking to people, understanding the problem space, that's always been part of what user interviews is about. And I think really has made it much easier to implement continuous research for us. There's really been no friction. So that's, I think, the company context. I think like on the personal side of things, like I said, I started my career in design. And I think fairly quickly, I learned about the importance of talking to people and how that impacts the quality of the solutions that I was working on. But they were often project-based research. So we were validating an idea, or we were running a click test. We were talking to 5 to 8 people, or maybe a bit larger of a sample size. And I think as I transitioned into the world of product management, it was a little more difficult to apply that way of working. It didn't line up very well with the way we were trying to run product. I think as a PM, part of my job is to help the team figure out what are we focusing on? What are we focusing on from a learning perspective? Where are we placing our bets on the solution side of things? But I also think about the way that we're learning as continuous. So there's a lot of information coming at the product team all the time, whether that's feedback from the customer success team or the data that we're collecting from features that we've shipped or other product pods have shipped. And so we kept getting this learning, and it didn't line up with this batch research that we were trying to do up front in some of these and some of this work. And so for me, as I sort of found continuous research, and Teresa Torres was a big influence on the work that we do, it just lined up more clearly. As we develop a deeper understanding of the problem space, we can almost in real time have better conversations with the target audience. And that sort of give and take about learning from other sources and applying that learning to the conversations has been a really important reason for why continuous interviewing and research, and especially in this format for user interviews, I think has been successful, and why we wanted to do it.
That's great. Yeah, and I think it's interesting that the founding story you mentioned is kind of similar to the founding story of Sprig. So maybe that's how research tools get built, is we have good people trying to build products and need extra support that doesn't exist. But yeah, I think, for me also kind of was similar there. And I think, Sprig as a company is built as a tool that supports the kind of in-context research we're doing really well. So there was kind of an obvious match there that kind of led to us starting it. But also I had that experience at Etsy, and I really was excited at the chance to kind of build on that and make it, even more seamless and more valuable after having seen the effects of it there. So yeah, I think it's the kind of thing that can seem really daunting at first, but once you set it up, it starts to pay dividends.
I was interested to hear a little bit about the customer centricity and sort of maybe what it's done for Sprig or for your time at Etsy about bringing the customer lens into a lot of the conversations. Yeah.
Well, I think so at Etsy, it kind of started, and maybe a little context, it started initially as an NPS program that was kind of handed to me. And, as a researcher, I have a lot of feelings about NPS, mostly not positive. There's a few little reasons why I think NPS might still be worthwhile. But so I was kind of handed that program, and it was something that kind of existed, but it was like this big, heavy quarterly survey, and it wasn't really being actioned on. So I tried to really rethink that whole system. And we came up with an approach that, still had NPS in it. And I think one of the benefits of NPS for anybody who's struggling with an NPS program is it's something that executives and board members, for example, tend to be pre-bought into because it's so well known and so widespread, and you can benchmark yourself, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of a good way into a broader continuous research program. But I was able to add in, other metrics, other sources of data. So we were not running just this one quarterly survey, but we had more of a constant pulse on the user. And just having that constant source of data and being able to triangulate and see what was going on under it was able to just, it's hard, I can't explain exactly the mechanism that made it happen, but I could say that ultimately, like, we were reporting out with the executive team on a monthly basis, and we were being asked all these really good questions about what customers need and what's driving that. That really led to a lot more openness to research actually kind of driving some of these conversations rather than being the kind of the afterthought. And so I think, that's exactly in a lot of ways what we're trying to achieve, or at least one of the big things we're trying to achieve as researchers. So yeah, it was pretty rewarding.
Yeah, I love that. I think the stories that continuous research also allows you to tell other stakeholders and other team members is another reason I think we've had success. One, you can bring people along for the ride throughout. They're seeing the progress incrementally. But two, you're also building up a larger repository of stories to draw from, or data points to draw from,
Totally.
Which I think for us has been another reason that it's sort of been an effective approach, and one of the reasons we continue to do it. Cool. So maybe at this point we can actually talk about the audience, ask the audience about whether or not the first poll, I guess, whether or not continuous interviewing is something that is happening in your organizations, or what your relationship to it is. And then as those answers come in, maybe Allison and I can talk about some of the barriers that we've heard of. I've talked to a lot of researchers and PMs, and I think I hear continuous interviewing and continuous research come up a lot. But I also hear about the barriers that make it hard to start and hard to sort of build a habit of doing.
Yeah, I think, as researchers, and I think I'm in an interesting position being a researcher who my target audience is researchers. So I actually do research with researchers a lot. And one thing I have learned from that research is no matter how big, even if you have a team of hundreds of researchers, you don't feel like you have enough researchers. Researchers always feel strapped. You always feel like there's more you could be doing. And there's always lots of like immediate needs and important things to do. So it can feel really daunting and difficult to set aside time for a program that is more open-ended and doesn't have a like direct, clear output. But I think, what I've learned is that, putting a little planning time up front helps really, set it up so that it doesn't take a ton of ongoing effort, and it starts to pay dividends down the road when you're getting insights, being able to kind of feed in to the research and to the planning and business road mapping that you're doing already. So it looks like we have our poll results. I think this is pretty in line with what we expected. I'm excited to see that we have actually more than half of people are either setting up a program or running a program already. I would love, maybe people can discuss in the chat if they're not already, like, what does your program look like, or what are the challenges that you're having? I think that could make for some interesting discussion later on.
Yeah, I would love to hear those. I think just to add a few notes, some of the things that I've heard when talking to PMs and researchers, and maybe in the chat, people can say if these are some of the challenges that they're facing. One is that I think there's both a perception and probably reality that this can be time consuming depending on your approach. And I think it's easy, especially in the beginning when it's not a habit, to do other things. There's a lot of things going on, like you said. On the product side, there's always other things that we can be focused on, reviewing data, preparing the next solution set. And so it's easy to be focused on those things. But I think for us, it's been a matter of once the habit has been established, it's been a really good way to sort of continue doing it. And the rest of the cross-functional pod that I described also gets a big value from the context that they get from those interviews. So I think including a number of people from that team has also really helped us get buy-in, and even if I'm not there, someone else can often do the interview. So it's not contingent on one person being the main hub of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just think it's interesting how the system works, how the system is likely or potentially works for you, having, as the product team, as a product manager, you can kind of take those insights and like make decisions directly, from them, almost in real time. So I imagine there's some element of it, speeding up your overall decision-making process when you have all that body to draw on, versus, as researchers, we have to take the insights and then share them and embed them and evangelize them. So there's always an extra step there. So it must be it. Yeah, I think that makes it, I can see like definitely a different thread of value there as a product team.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of conversations in the product, the sort of product articles and things that I read about product sense or product intuition or whatever you want to call it. And I think part of the value of continuous research is you build up that understanding of the problem space, and it's not one person, it's the group. And so as a team, we have that sort of product sense, and I think it does over time actually speed up the decision-making process for us, or at least give us more confidence in the decisions that we're making. So yeah, I think there's a lot of benefits as this sort of continues and as this program gets underway.
Awesome. Okay, well, why don't we dive into the next section here? We're going to be talking now through the specific frameworks that Paolo and I are each using in our roles, and then we'll talk through, how you can actually combine these frameworks to make an even better program. So to start with, let's just introduce the different frameworks we're using. So first, the kind of the method that Paolo is using, he'll talk through his framework of conducting weekly qualitative interviews. So what that looks like for him, how he does it. I'll talk then a little bit more about the framework that I'm using at Sprig, using a consistent flow of in-context research. And then again, we'll talk at the end a little bit about how you can combine these approaches to kind of support and enhance each other. So to start, I will turn it over to you, Paolo.
Perfect. Yeah. So basically, like, first of all, like I said, we're doing these weekly, and I'm going to be referencing user interviews in here. So we use our own tool to manage the setup process and manage the and sort of manage the recruiting. I think the important part for this is that as long as you can reduce friction in this process, that's the really critical part. And any way to do that, I think, is going to be helpful. So I think to go into a concrete example, over the sort of Q3 and Q4 of 2021, our pod was focused on helping researchers review and approve applicants that were a good fit. So similar to Allison, our audience and our customers are researchers. And as they start research projects and we help them find potential participants, they need to then review those participants, pick the ones that are the best fits, approve them, and then obviously manage the scheduling, et cetera. So we were trying to help them really improve the way they found, reviewed, and then approved participants. So first thing we did is we needed to sort of narrow in on our target audience. I think one of the really important parts about doing continuous interviewing like this, or interviewing every week, is you need to be talking to the right people. It really hinges, all the work that cascades from this comes from the conversations we're having. And so we did a decent amount of work trying to understand who we wanted to talk to, what were the behaviors that we expected to see. And so that was sort of a little bit of upfront work that we did one time. And we worked with the data analytics team to sort of understand some of those things. From that point, we had a couple of choices. One, at user interviews, we have an existing panel hub of our customers. So what we ended up doing is we ended up adding some additional researchers to that hub based on that work that we had done with analytics. So we just uploaded them to our hub. And then from there, we were basically we created a project with a very short screener, and we were able to invite researchers in small batches to this project. So, what we would do is we'd send out invites for 15 or 20 people to the 15 or 20 researchers. The goal was to schedule 1 to 2 interviews any given week. We'd usually get back 5 or 6 people who were interested, and we'd get them scheduled and go through the process. And that process would repeat itself. So I'd say every 2 to 3 weeks, we were spending maybe 15 or 20 minutes sending out a new batch, reviewing a few applicants, and sort of approving them to kick off the scheduling process.
Got it. And I'm curious what you would say, for your program, what's the important part of doing this continuously versus ad hoc? Like, what's the extra value you're getting there?
Yeah, I think it's similar to the sort of what I was trying to describe before. When we started this, we didn't really understand why researchers approved different participants, what their thought process was. Mm-hmm. So the first handful of interviews was just getting an understanding of that space. Like, what were the factors in the decision-making process? How did researchers set up projects? The question we asked, the major question we asked is, tell me about a recent research project you've done. And yes, we cared about the approval stuff, but we also cared about all the things that went into building a research project, targeting audience members, and then all the factors that sort of went into approvals from there. So, I think we started not knowing a lot, but then if you fast forward a month or 2 into that process, we've shipped a few ideas to test. We've done some prototyping. We've gotten feedback from customer success and sales, and all of a sudden our understanding of that problem is much different. And so the questions we ask, even though it's the same question we lead off with, the quality and depth of the discussion changes. Yeah. And so that for us is like a really important sort of part of how we think about research and why we prefer to do it that way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That makes a lot of sense. And I guess so now you're doing these research sessions every week for months. You're collecting lots of interview transcripts, lots of data. What's your process for analyzing and synthesizing all of this?
Yeah, I think there's so we, again, sort of going back to the Teresa Torres framework, she's got this idea of an opportunity solution tree. So what you're looking at here is actually our opportunity solution tree from Q3 and Q4 last year. And the idea of an opportunity solution tree is basically to organize your understanding of the problem space or the opportunity space in such a way that you can make better decisions. So what we would do is at the end of every interview, we would create a snapshot. Snapshot is just sort of like, what are some of the insights that we had from the conversation? What are the opportunities or problems, desires, needs of the person that we were talking to? Those snapshots, by the way, are great to share with other people in the organization, other stakeholders. They allow sort of people to tag along without being part of the interviews. You can attach clips to those. But after doing a few of those, we would then take those opportunities and try to organize them based on our understanding of the world. And that's sort of what you're looking at here. And those opportunities allow us as a product team to make trade-off decisions. Where do we want to focus? Do we want to focus on this opportunity or that? What are the competitive ramifications? What are the business ramifications? Which one do we think will help us achieve the outcome that we're pursuing for this quarter more effectively? So I think that's sort of like one way we organize the information. And I'll say that this change, like the interviews, this changes over time as well. This is probably the 5th or 6th version of this opportunity map, as our understanding morphed over the course of those 2 quarters.
Yeah. And so is this like, how does this program overall? So it sounds like you're creating this map and then iterating on it and starting to kind of make some decisions. Is this the main body of research that you and your team are doing, or is there other research that you do along the way as part of your process? Yeah,
I think for us, this is only part of sort of the research portfolio within the pod. I think so out of the work of opportunities, then we still have to do ideation. We still have to sort of decide on the potential solutions that we want to pursue. We still have to test those solutions. And I think in those cases, the work to test the solutions is very much like the sort of approach that I described when I was talking about my early career in design. We will really work to validate or test those ideas using a number of different methods. That might be a usability test, that might be a survey, but we're going back out and sort of testing these ideas. So again, what we're looking at here is just an example from that process. So we had a solution idea that we were considering, and we basically spun up an unmoderated test, and we said, and the designer on our team actually led this. And we were trying to answer some quick questions about a prototype that we had designed. And this again sort of augments our understanding of the space, but also will help us say yes or no to this solution, or maybe iterate on it and go forward. So I would say continuous research informs all of this work, but it's only a part of the sort of research portfolio for the pod and the way that we work.
Yeah, that's great. And I love how you mentioned, you mentioned this earlier, but I thought of it again when you mentioned the designer led this task, how you're really running this program as a cross-functional effort. Do you actually have, some of the different people you mentioned, like designers and customer success and other engineers, maybe even running some of those interviews, the weekly interviews? Yeah,
we trade off. So I think the designer in particular joins these. We'll run the open-ended conversations. We also sometimes invite research into the process. Sometimes research has sat in and or run sessions. Engineers are often in there taking notes, but we often encourage them if they're interested to run a session. So I think important to have cross-functional representation, and would love and make the opportunity available to anyone who actually wants to step in and run these. We have they're pretty loose in terms of the questions we're answering, but we have some structure to how we open the conversation and sort of how we close the conversation. So it's there as sort of a tool for others as they want to step in.
That's great.
Maybe we can, I know Sprig, obviously the framework is a bit different, so I'd love to hear a little bit more about the details on your side.
I would love to share them. So yeah, this diagram shows a little bit more of what we're doing at Sprig. So we're taking kind of the more, I guess, quantitative approach to Paolo's qualitative approach. Although I would say you don't need to be like a heavy quant researcher or quant anybody to be able to do this. It can be relatively simple to set up, and I'll go into that a little bit more. But essentially, the idea is we set up an in-context survey, meaning a quick survey that surfaces within the user experience of Sprig. So as people are actually using the product, and we ask a few targeted questions about their experience, and then critically an open-ended question as well, so that we're able to collect that more qualitative feedback to help understand some of the responses. And then, this is a survey that we set up once, and then it's just continuously running for users as they're interacting with the product, and we're able to just collect insights over time. So there's a little initial setup to set it up, but then once it's going, it's really pretty hands-off, except for in the sense that we're constantly checking in. So I'm leading this program, but our product managers, designers, all members of the team, our CEO is checking in and looking at those results. And as we identify, themes to follow up on, or things that we're seeing in the data that are unexpected or interesting, we're able to kind of pull those insights and dig in further with more in-depth research, or take that a step further as a kind of indicator of what we want to pursue next.
Very cool. So it sounds like you're setting it up, but also it sort of can inform a lot of people and sort of give them insight into what's going on. Maybe you can talk about what this looks like in practice a little bit more.
Yeah. So let me actually take you to the actual survey that we're running. So this is this is the actual survey that we have running in Sprig. I think you said this earlier about we talked about the right audience. I think when we think about in-context surveys, it's always like right questions, right people, and right time. So for a continuous survey like this, the right question, the idea for us is to have a question that is, broad enough to not, lead the participants to focus in any one particular area, but also specific enough to focus on the product experience itself, because that's really what we're concerned with. So that's about these questions. These questions that you can see here are really pretty simple, just a straight satisfaction question. And then the second one is more geared at what our product team is specifically trying to accomplish, having users get insights quickly and easily. And then, the open-ended question is really, in a lot of ways, the most important question, because, what we'll get from those first two questions is a number that is really helpful, because as we start to see, if we see that trend going down, that's a red flag for us that we need to look in to see what's going on. But even if the trend line looks great, there's still a lot that we can learn from the open-ended questions. And it's really, even, to me, I've been doing this for a while, it's still very surprising to see the granularity of the responses that you get from an in-product study when you are asking, again, like that right question at the right time in the moment. You get really, really useful feedback. Couple other things to note is that, with in-context surveys, you do want to think about kind of the targeting. So the right people part of it is focusing on people, like for us, we want to target people who are experienced enough to, be able to answer these questions well, essentially. We don't necessarily want to get people in the onboarding process. Now, you might want to have a continuously running survey that's just focused on onboarding. That's not what we're doing here. So we try and target users who have signed up at least 30 days ago. And then we target so that the survey surfaces across a range of commonly used pages on the app. One thing to keep in mind is you don't want to interrupt users in the middle of a flow. So at Sprig, this survey that we're doing is really, pretty broad and general. For some of our customers who are using Sprig for similar purposes, they might, be B2C companies with millions of users. So rather than just having one broad survey, they might be sending like 10 or 20 even of these continuous studies that are running across what they see as the core user journeys on their site. And so in those cases, they'll often want to trigger the survey at the end of completing a flow. So, at the end of, if you're a fintech company, like placing a trade or making a deposit, whatever it might be. And so then you're able to get, again, kind of a broad view of what's going on, but specific enough to extract insights that are actually, valuable and that you can use to inform decisions and know when to dig in further. Then, the other part, so you can see there's an opt-in at the end that we have for research. So we are able to use, the in-context survey as well to identify users who we can target for research. But the other last thing I think is important to note is just, again, you don't need to use Sprig to do this. You just need access to some in-product tool. I know some companies even have DIY tools that they've built in-house. The one thing to just think about is making sure they are able to kind of monitor the user experience, control the user experience. So, a lot of people are concerned about disrupting users or bombarding them with constant surveys. So you just want to make sure that you have controls in place to ensure that you're not going to surface a survey to users more than once every, whatever it might be that makes sense to you, 30 days, 90 days, 180 days, whatever it is, as a way to kind of control the experience. And so if you have kind of those few pieces in mind in setup, then you're really able to kind of just set it and forget it, like I said, and just look as the insights come in and help see how you can pull that into your other work.
Yeah, actually, that was a question I had, Allison. So you talk about pulling it into your other work. You had talked about other teams looking at this. Similar to what you asked me, interested to sort of hear how this sort of in-context survey fits into your overall research program and sort of how it influences some of the other work that you might do.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are, we have other ongoing research that is, not directly related to this in any way, related more to what's on our current roadmap, what are things that we already know that we are focused on, or other hypotheses we have. But this is constantly feeds in as well. So There's a couple ways. I mentioned, if the trend line goes down, that's automatically a red flag that we want to dig into. Luckily, we haven't had that one yet at Sprig, hopefully ever. But the other things that we get from this is sometimes there'll be a trend that we'll see in open-end analysis that will help us indicate that we want to dig in. So I'll show you an example of that. So this is an example. This is a picture of Sprig. Sprig offers open text analysis. So, obviously, if you don't have Sprig, you can still look at your open ends, do manual coding. But Sprig this is what you're seeing here. So what you're seeing here are themes that are emerging from the open-ended responses from this survey. And this one that's here at the top is one that really jumped out at us, making it easier to know my study is running correctly. This was something that we didn't fully understand. Looking through the responses, we were a little confused about it because, as far as we knew, people's studies were running just fine. So we were able to actually follow up with some of the users who gave us feedback, do additional research. And we found out that, it wasn't so much, there wasn't anything necessarily wrong with the surveys, but, really launching a survey in your product experience can be a bit of a stressful experience, especially if you're doing it just for the first few times, because you are, launching something that's going to go live to your users. So we were able to understand like what the underlying concern there was for users, and we were able to figure out some ways, brainstorm as a product team what potential solutions would be, and we came up with some ideas for how we could help users feel more confident and validate that the survey was set up correctly before launching, as well as giving them ways to confirm that it's set up correctly and working correctly after launching. And so those items have some of them have launched already, some are on our current roadmap, and we're able to kind of pull, again, coming from that in context continuous research and pulling into actually leading to a product decision that will hopefully improve the experience for our customers.
Yeah, that's a great example of sort of like digging in deeper. I don't know. Do you have other ways that you also validate insights? Like this is about understanding context and digging in more, but are there other approaches you take to sort of the validation side of things?
Yeah, so we do. Obviously the continuous research piece feeds into this kind of research is here. And then also, on the other side of that research, that sometimes we want, we aren't totally confident, even after talking to users, in exactly what to do. So an example that I could give of that is a research study that was actually mostly initiated independently of our continuous tracking, although we did have some indicators in the study there. But the goal of the research really was to kind of understand what was holding users back who had signed up for a free account and hadn't yet launched a survey in Sprig. And we learned something in the research which was actually pretty conclusive. So I think sometimes in research, you'll hear, you'll have the results you need, but then you'll hear like that one user who says something that's really interesting if true, but you're not quite sure. That's a great use case for validating in a product survey tool. In this case, we actually heard a pretty consistent feedback on the topic, but it represented a pretty big change to the product. And so we wanted to validate before we move forward. And so we launched a survey. So the idea was that rather than signing up being an indicator that someone is intending to like get started and move forward with Sprig right away, it actually is just an early stage often in the evaluation process. And they're really signing up as a way to figure out what Sprig is all about. And so we launched a quick in-context survey for first-time visitors, the first time they came to the site. And we were able to, very clearly validate that what users had told us, or what potential users had told us in our user research sessions, actually aligns really well with what our actual new first-time visitors were telling us. And so that gave us the confidence we needed as a product team to be able to kind of move forward with making some changes.
Yeah, that's terrific. I think that we've got some very clear similarities between the two frameworks, but also I think some interesting differences. Obviously, the sort of approach we take to the overall framework is a bit different. And I think maybe we transition here to another poll. Would love to understand, you've heard two frameworks. is there one of these that might work for your organization? So really interested to sort of hear what the audience has to say, sort of having gone through this. And I know a number of you are already implementing continuous research, so I don't know if it sort of follows one of these models or maybe something different. Also interested to hear that in the chat or in the Q&A.
Yeah, and I'm just noticing we're out over time. This is kind of our transition to Q&A time, but we still have a bit more content that we'd like to cover. So what do you think? Should we maybe, oh, all right, we already got our quiz questions. Yeah, both. I love that. This is perfect, because this is exactly what we wanted to show you next, is ways that you can actually, put these two approaches together to kind of build on one another. So yeah, Paolo, do you want to kick that off?
Yeah, so I think caveat, this was an idea that came to Allison and I as we were talking about our two approaches and sort of talking about how continuous research differs and is the same. So this is really just sort of like an idea of how I think this could work together. And when we were chatting, it was very focused on sort of user interviews and Sprig, but again, I think could work in a lot of contexts. But basically the idea that we've got is on the top line there, you see the framework that Allison described, and you've got the in-context survey running. And what we're hoping that does is that would allow you to really target users effectively. So Allison described putting this on specific flows or trying to figure out certain behaviors to target off of, and then actually using that as a way, one, to get a pulse and answer some of those questions that Allison was describing, but two, invite them into the panel. So that feeds the panel. And if you look at the bottom of this diagram, we've got a panel that exists of these researchers. And from that panel, we are now recruiting into qualitative interviews on a weekly basis. And so really getting the continuous pulse and sense of things from the in-context surveys that feeds into the qualitative weekly interviews. And so it was kind of fun to talk about how these two might work together. And I don't know if anyone in the audience is actually running something like this. Would love to sort of talk about it either in the chat or maybe on LinkedIn afterwards. But we were excited about the idea of this, even though neither of us has implemented this completely yet.
Yeah, although we'll see whether that changes in the near future, because I'm particularly very excited about this. So yeah, I think with that, we can hand it back to Zoe, and then we'll get to Q&A.
Perfect. So I'm launching a final poll now. Since we've been talking a little bit about how user interviews and Sprig can be used independently or together to fuel this continuous research workflow, we did want to take a moment and offer everyone here the opportunity to sign up for a demo with either or both of our teams to learn a little bit more about these tools. So please use the poll to let us know if you'd like to opt into a demo, and our respective teams will reach out to coordinate. So I'll leave that up for a couple of minutes. In the meantime, let's transition to Q&A. We have had tons of questions. We won't get to all of them. So afterwards, we will pass some of the most popular ones and provide quick answers in a summary. But the question with the most votes from Sudi was, do you have tips on how to structure continuous research for a team of one researcher?
Yeah, I mean, I could definitely comment on that from the in-context survey side of the framework. I think, I mean, my advice would be to just start with one simple survey. I mentioned some of our customers have these studies that are multiple in-context surveys running across key points of the journey. Even if you have lots of key points of the journey, I would always recommend starting small, start with just one. Regardless of how you do it, whether it's in-context survey or not, you don't have to do it all at once. Just start with one small thing, see if you can get some value out of it. One key flow in the user journey, set up a continuous survey there. And the more that you can get bang for your buck from that survey, like if you can, use that to target users for recruiting so that you can speak to them in other research, whether it's related to your the continuous survey results or not, definitely take advantage of that. Also, having a way something I think one of the things with a research team of one is like creating that visibility and teaching people about teaching or educating stakeholders about the value of research. So making sure that data that you're getting from that study is somewhere that's accessible to everyone and kind of front and center, so that people can understand the value, can maybe learn some things and figure some things out on their own, and maybe build a case for that second researcher as well.
Yeah, on the sort of weekly interview side of things, I think one thing is to drive down the amount of time you're spending on logistics. I think that can be sort of overwhelming if you're spending an hour or 2 hours trying to get these things scheduled. When I actually joined user interviews, the pod that I'm a part of was just being built. And so I was actually sort of alone at the beginning of this. And so part of what I tried to do is actually recruit people from other parts of the business that were not part of the product pod yet, to just participate in that process, just sitting on an interview, or even conduct an interview, so lead, and I would take notes. So part of this was just like finding people to do this with where I could. The other part was trying to drive down the amount of time it took me to set these up. Because the more time it takes me to set up, as a single person, you've got a lot of requests coming, and you've got to find a way to focus and do spend less time on that and more time on the interviews and the synthesis. So those are two things that I tried to do when I joined user interviews, and was sort of, I wasn't a researcher, I was a PM, but still similar idea.
Thanks. Those are great practical tips. The second question's from Megan, and they're asking, I've seen continuous research lead to small ends or the wrong ends driving decision-making. Curious how you might mitigate this risk.
Again, on the in-context survey side, this is where targeting is really important. So, I mean, if you have a small user base, then you're going to have a small n, because obviously not 100% of users are going to respond to your survey, although you'll get a much higher response rate in product than you will over email if it's survey versus survey. But, I think that the idea there is to actually, if you have a really small n, look at who those people are answering the question. If you have a larger customer base, then it's really in the targeting and making sure that you're not targeting, some esoteric part of the product where a really non-representative group of users is likely to respond, and having a few different triggers throughout. But then the other big piece is just, validate. If you don't have confidence in what you're learning, or if you don't feel like you have a larger N, then don't make a decision based on that one bit of insight. Try, come up with other ways to validate, look at other data sources, et cetera, and try and combine different threads together to gain confidence in that insight.
Yeah, on the qualitatives, I agree. I mean, I think confidence is such an important part of this, but also the targeting is critical, because you want to make sure you're not just talking to power users or not just talking to one type of organization, and you can spread that out. I will say, like, when you're really doing this continuously, the end does grow. So just as an example, I think we did almost 40 interviews across those 2 quarters. And that was just the open-ended ones. We did validation and other work to drive up the confidence. But even like those amount of conversations really does help you build like a context for what that person is going through. And it helped us at least feel like we had a good understanding of the nuances that were going on. We could really understand when one person was doing it differently than another person. But I agree completely. Like, if you don't have confidence, there are other ways to sort of up the confidence level using other methods.
The next question is also from Megan. I'd be curious to hear your take on the benefit of continuous research programs versus simply inviting non-researchers to shadow and participate in researcher-led studies that are already happening.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I would say definitely do both. I think I definitely am a big proponent of having non-researchers participate in research as much in any way you can kind of come up with to get them engaged and involved and feel ownership over the insights. But I think, I mean, the nice thing about continuous research is it is really, open-ended we try and keep it really open-ended. So even a researcher-led study that might be more forward-looking and strategic and not necessarily tied to the current roadmap probably has some hypotheses built in, or some, you're exploring something, and that's super important research. It's certainly not a lesser form of research, but it is a little bit of a different thing. So I would just say do both.
Yeah, I think one question we run into is there are often some of the teams I talk to, there aren't that many researchers that are there yet. And so this would be like limiting the capacity of research that could be going on at an organization. So for example, at User Interviews, we have a research team, but it's a fairly small research team. They do a lot of work to educate the rest of the organization about how to do research, but they're also conducting strategic research and sharing that with the company. But the amount of research, we would be limited by the amount of research that we could do as an organization if we relied just on the researchers to do that work. So I think both are really good to have, but by helping other people do this research and put these programs in place, you just expand the speed of learning that's happening at the organization.
The next question from an anonymous poster: is there any advice on how to consolidate emerging themes from the continuous research series over time versus potentially overweighing feedback from a single session?
Yeah, this one, I can take a first shot. I think for us, like I shared that opportunity map. We'll usually wait until we have 5 or 6 interviews under our belt before we sort of create the first one of those. And then we will, every few weeks we'll be updating that. So part of this is just like continuously coming back and actually re-editing the work that you're doing and really thinking critically about how you're organizing that space. So I think that's part of it, just sort of refreshing your understanding. The other part is just about holding yourself accountable to where you're hearing that feedback. But I also think some of this comes out in the validation process. So we pick an opportunity that we're pursuing, we can go to validate an idea, and we can check our thinking and see if the solution is actually more widely applicable to the audience that we're pursuing. So I think there's sort of checks and balances in a couple of places, the way that we do our work.
I think we have time for a couple more questions from Dulce. How do you sift weak signals from noise?
In the more quantitative approach, I think this is a bit easier because we are looking at like numbers, and we're trying to keep it. We talked about like kind of the right users, so trying to keep it representative. So there, it's more like if we hear a theme from one person, a response from one person that's really unique and interesting, we'll generally, note it, but maybe not take any action until we start to see it coming up more often. And then, if it's something that's really interesting anyway, we might try and dig in and do some more research. But it's really in the numbers, I think, on the quantitative side.
Yeah, on the qualitative side, I think I describe validation as it relates to, or testing as it relates to solutions. But we'll often do that actually as it relates to opportunities as well. So we might say, here's an opportunity, here's our assumption or our guess about how applicable this is or how widely felt this pain point might be. But then we can often run another kind of research project to actually validate that assumption at the opportunity level. So we might send a survey out and try to get a feel for how many other researchers are experiencing this pain point. So if we're truly like worried about that, the weak signal versus strong, we can also do some additional work at the project level.
Awesome. I think we need to leave it there. There's tons of questions. So like I said, we will pass some of the most popular ones and provide some responses. But thank you everyone so much for joining us today. Allison, Paolo, thank you for sharing your insights with us. We will be following up with anyone who requested a demo from our teams, and you can expect some follow-up materials from today's session to be available soon. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.